Dr. Adeyemi Dipeolu, who is Special Advisor to the President on Economic Matters, is still here. We're just before we went on break, I was asking you about that lull in spending, and you say that it didn't add to it didn't contribute to it.
No, it's. I think we have to realize that spending doesn't stop automatically on December 31. First of all, there are constitutional provisions that allow government to continue to spend to the levels of the previous year before the next budget is passed. And so you found that salaries were indeed being paid, debts were being settled, even there were interventions to support the states, all of which took place even before the budget was passed. So strictly speaking, you cannot say that there was no expenditure at all.
But did you hear that complaint?
Well, I read about it, but I just wondered where it was coming from, because again, you also have to understand, of course, that when you are in an economic situation in which you found yourself, you don't worsen it through actions. If you print money, for instance, to spend, or when you haven't raised the revenue, you will just further complicate the situation. So it's also important to realize that there is the revenue dimension to expenditure. In other words, the plan was to say, okay, we're not going to raise tax rates because that doesn't help in a situation in which the economy is vulnerable, but we're going to widen the tax net. We're going to make sure that more and more enterprises and people pay their due taxes. So all along in the course of the year, FIRS was registering new companies, bringing them into the tax net, and so you had 700,000 new companies that have been brought into the tax net already. In other words, action was going on anyway, and we mustn't dramatize the fact that the budget was passed late, although it would have been ideal if it had come out a bit better, mainly because of the ramping up of capital expenditure and the need to borrow.
Let's go to Lagos now.
Well, I mean, what policies are being put in place to ensure that manufacturers, I mean, this complaint that they give on a regular basis becomes history? What interventionist or protective policies are you considering or advising government to consider such that manufacturing sector can stop complaining?
Okay, thank you very much. I think the starting point, of course, is to look at in what areas you can best support manufacturers. And I think the first one, of course, is to realize that they will face constraints in terms of the cost of production and the cost of borrowing, and in transactions cost, the cost of doing business. So one of the first things that the government had prioritized was to just ease the doing of business, to say, make it easier for people who are running businesses to get, businesses registered, to pay taxes, to basically get permits. In other words, just make it easier. And you remember the whole story about trying to improve our rankings in the World Bank from about moving from 169 by 20 places up. But in addition, the whole idea behind the spending on infrastructure was also to tackle some of the costs that manufacturers face. You do, of course, remember that we had ramped up electricity production to as high as 5,000 megawatts in February, I think a historic high, until vandalization resulted in a drop in electricity power, but also improving the roads, improving the rail. You bring down the costs by which manufacturers have to do business. And then there's the whole issue of the cost of borrowing, which I know is upfront in many people's minds. But if you've chosen to have a liberal financial system, it's not ideal, I think, to say that government should just intervene and say this is the interest rate. It leads to all sorts of distortions. But one of the things that you can do is to have intervention funds. Is to have intervention funds that enable people who are doing business to be able to access resources. So you have the intervention funds, for instance, through development finance institutions like BOI, the Bank of Industry, where people can access interest rates at single digits. You have the fund set up for the MSMEs, micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises.
Well, we did have the special advisor to the Central Bank Government Development Finance here yesterday, and he spoke at great length on some of these intervention funds. But then there have been complaints about them. Have you heard any of the complaints? For instance, the Bank of Industry, which you just spoke about, they have said that it only gives you capital to buy equipment. It doesn't give you any working capital. And some businesses say that's where, if we really need the money there, and we already have the equipment, how does that help us?
Yes, indeed. I mean, you are right. But as I said, what you try to do within your own context, first of all, you're running a business. Businesses have costs, right? But if you want to be competitive in global terms, then of course you do intervene where the capacity of government is, infrastructure, ease of doing business, intervention funds to help businesses to thrive. You even, if they were facing at some stage a foreign exchange constraint. And so other members of society had to give up foreign exchange needs, and the central bank says we want to dedicate 60% of the foreign exchange to manufacturing industries. In other words, you intervene where your powers can help you to intervene, and you do so in a manner that people can run businesses competitively. And I'm not saying that people don't face difficulties in terms of working capital. They probably do. But I'm saying you intervene on the areas in which you can help to bring those costs down.
Now, the thing is, if you say that, the Bank of Industry is one of the places that people can go and get loans at single digits, because one of the complaints of any manufacturer is that double-digit interest rates does not help anybody. If you're going to the bank to get, working capital at 25%, 30%, you have to ask what sort of business is that person doing in the very first instance. So if you say that, one of the things that we've done is to ensure that, people can get single-digit interest rates through these interventionist agencies, but then they don't provide working capital. Where can people go to get working capital at single-digit interest rates?
Well, that's it's a question that I think a manufacturer will have to answer, because they would have to tell us. Why would I tell a company where to get its working capital from? It's a private enterprise. Why? I mean, you cannot run a private enterprise economy and say at the same time that every intervention you want government to intervene. In other words, in one situation, you don't want state ownership of enterprise. In one step, you don't want state intervention with enterprise, but you want the state to intervene in every aspect of enterprise running.
They're not asking
states cannot.
They're not asking for free money. What the government is also concerned about how the manufacturers are doing. Government is concerned about the economy.
Absolutely.
Government knows that one of the ways they will grow the economy is through the involvement of the private sector. And they're saying that if we have interest rates at 25 to 30% from the banks, it is definitely not. It's almost impossible for businesses to be able to do any sort of business with those kinds of interest rates. If government is saying, this is how we're helping you, and this is how we think that you can. The money is not for free. They're still going to be paying interest on it.
Absolutely.
Well, how come is it that they're not getting working capital at all?
But you have to help me here. You have a liberalized financial system. In other words, you went through financial liberalization. The state does not own the banks, right? The private sector is also in private hands, and what you have banks as means of financial intermediation. And so, if the source of funds is high, best that government can do in a liberalized financial system is to give intervention support. Otherwise, what you're asking for is that the government should set the interest rate at a particular level. I don't think that is particularly workable. And I'm sure there are ways and means by which industries do raise working capital, including from their savings and other things that they generate, because some of them retain profit to be enable them to run their businesses on a continuous basis. But again, the private sector is not all about manufacturing.
Let me come in here. Let me come in here, and it's got to do with something owned by the government. I agree that the government doesn't own the banks, but let's talk about ministries, agencies, and parastatals, and it has to do with the ease of doing business, which manufacturers and so many people in the country have complaints about. How difficult has that been for the government to reduce all of that bottlenecks to making business quite easy in the country?